I have the privilege of traveling internationally to do this work, and one of the things that this does for me is it teaches me a lot, but also opens my eyes to some new and important practices and rituals related to suicide prevention, and I will do one of them now. It's called Acknowledgement of Country. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the people whose land we are gathered on today. I pay respects to their elders in the past, for they have laid the foundation for us to walk, and elders of today who carry forward the stories and traditions. I'd like to acknowledge any First Nation, Indigenous, Aboriginal, and Native people gathered here today. We as non-Indigenous people have much to learn from the oldest living cultures on Earth. And while that's not necessarily part of our conversation today, it's an important thing to do for our field. And we were just on the heels of the diversity committee, and so I feel like it's an important thing to continue to do. So our conversation today is leveraging lived experience in emergency response for suicide prevention and suicide grief support. And I'm just going to ask the panelists to give us just kind of brief overview of who they are, what kind of connections they have to emergency responder service, and where they're from. So we'll start with Chris.
Hi, my name is Chris Calkins. I'm a paramedic. I'm a retired firefighter, 14 years, 5 months, 3 days, 6 minutes. I can show you the x-rays and CTs of why I don't do that anymore if you want to see that, but for another time. I am program director of an emergency medical services program up in White Bear Lake, Minnesota. Century College is the name. We train all levels of EMS responders, from emergency medical responder to EMT to paramedic, which is the highest level of pre-hospital care. I have done that since 1996. Part-time, I work for the city of Woodbury, currently where I am a paramedic and have been since 1995-ish. So a few years of experience there. I'm also the executive director of this group called Center for Suicide Research that does original research on suicide and related phenomenon. We have an international presence, and I've had the pleasure of working with Sally on a lot of those endeavors as well. Educationally, paramedic, public health, interdisciplinary research, and my doctorate's in education. Dissertation on suicide amongst emergency responders and the suicide rates there, and you'll see some of that in a second.
Assuming we get
Oh, perfect.
Okay, go ahead, Carla.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm from a little bit further north than Chris is in Canada. My name is Carla Thorpe. I'm the Director of Suicide Prevention for the Mental Health Commission of Canada, which is our equivalent of SAMHSA here in the US. So I've been working in suicide prevention specifically as it relates to first responders, military, and veterans for about the last 4 or 5 years. So it's a pleasure to be here and co-presenting with this amazing group of panelists.
Thanks, Juan.
Hi, I'm Juan Vigil from Denver, Colorado. I'm a lieutenant with the Denver Fire Department, and I got started with Sally approximately after February 2nd, 2013, after my captain committed suicide.
Thanks, Juan. Govan.
Hi, I'm Govan Martin, retired Pennsylvania State Police. I also ran our peer support program for 12 years. Currently chair of Prevent Suicide PA. I also do QPR training and assist training and International Critical and Stress Foundation training. So, and that's all I have to say for now.
We'll have to say more later. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is John Marks. I'm the Executive Director of the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, an organization that I founded after one of my law enforcement friends took his life. I worked 23 years in law enforcement, started at the county as a county sheriff in an area near here, and worked for a Metropolitan Denver Police Department for 21 years. I think what's more important for you is not so much what is my story, but what can you learn from my story? What can you learn from all of our stories? And we'll be sharing more of that. So glad you're here.
Great, thanks, guys. All right, well, now I'll share my story on how I got involved here. So my first internship in graduate school, my first major internship in graduate school was for a small private practice of police psychologists. And it was kind of the coolest internship to get. So I was really excited. So I cut my teeth professionally in that space, and then went off and did some other things. And then probably around 2012, I got approached by a firefighter from South Metro Fire Rescue Authority, and he said, we need to do something. And so at that time, we got funding from the Colorado Fallen Firefighters Foundation. Now that is a foundation that has funds to support families bereaved by line of duty death. And so to get funding from that organization to do something in suicide prevention was fairly unprecedented. And we created this little video on firefighters impacted by suicide, both by coworkers as well as the suicide that they were responding to out in the community. It's just a little 3 or 4 minute video, and it blew up on YouTube. And that is how Juan and his colleagues at the Denver Fire Department stumbled upon us back in 2013, about 6 months after Captain Magana's death. And I can picture it to this day, right? We had about 8 of us in that little tiny conference room sitting around a table, and you all looked at me and said, well, can you help us? And I said, I would love to, but I don't know a ton about fire service, honestly. But here's what I knew to be true. I knew that in the academy, you learn all kinds of things about warning signs and risk factors and a lot of the things that are in the community that can help people. I said, training like that's not gonna help you. What we need are stories. And it took about 18 months of us building trust with the team that came around the table that first day with me, an outsider. And after 18 months, we put together a pretty remarkable video of lived experience stories and a call to action, not just for the Denver Fire Department, but for fire service in general. And that's just led to a whole bunch of really amazing opportunities. Juan will share pieces of it, but Juan's chief Eric Tade, is now one of the biggest champions nationally for fire service suicide prevention, and is hosting, I think it's the first National Behavioral Health Symposium for fire service here in Colorado in September. So that was really exciting. And on the law enforcement side, we had a group from AAS, a task force that Govian was a part of, and a number of other folks. And same kind of thing. We said we need to do something. It needs to be portable, and it needs to be story driven. And back then, we put together. We had to have the president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police involved, and he wanted to make it his platform. And so we all gathered with a very small budget here in Denver. And again, they shared really powerful stories. I'll just share one with you to show you kind of how this powerful storytelling thing can really shift culture. So, Detective Sprague from the Denver Police Department had a really powerful story, and when I tell it to you, you're going to understand why it was so important. He's given us full permission to share this story, and his video on YouTube has been a huge part of this training curriculum that we pulled together. So he, as he says in his video, he came from a long line of cops and a long line of alcoholics. And when his partner was stabbed right in front of him, he experienced a very strong trauma response that quickly escalated in his drinking and then resulted in a near-fatal suicide attempt. And here's the part of the story that's really interesting. There's 2 parts for me. One is that he woke up mad. Why did I live, right? And he's mad, and he's in an locked inpatient psych unit, which is not really the place you want to be especially when you're a cop. And he's not very engaged. And somebody says, Joe, I think you need to go to a 12-step program. He's like, I don't want to go to a stinking 12-step program. And they said, Joe, there's coffee there. And the coffee has caffeine. And he's like, oh, well, now you've sold me. So he goes to the 12-step program, and he's moved. And he comes back, and he falls to his knees, and he says, you know what, God, if you have a plan for me, I could certainly use it now. And shortly thereafter, his chief and his deputy chief come to visit. And they're dressed in street clothes, which was really important for him, not to be identified as a police officer. And they came to his bedside, and they said, Joe, you are part of our family. And we will do anything we need to do to get you back. And so they did. He got sober, he got better, he came back, he served out the rest of his career, and now he farms somewhere on the plains of Colorado. But that story is so powerful on so many levels, right? It's powerful on the level of a number of ways that people can be influenced. It's powerful on the way that leadership specifically within first responder communities can make a huge difference. So that curriculum now has been adopted by the IACP leadership curriculum, which is very exciting. So that's kind of been why I've gotten connected to these folks and why I'm so excited. This particular panel is also supported by United Suicide Survivors International, which is an international group that is all about lifting up the voices of lived experience for systems and cultural change. And a number of our authors are also part of a project called Guts, Grit, and the Grind, which is a men's anthology of stories of everyday men coming through hard times and learning from those experiences and sharing their lessons learned with others. So this is United Survivors. We've been around for a little bit, but doing more now with webinars, and we have an online course and other kinds of things. All right, so here's where we're headed. Why do lived experience stories matter in emergency responder, suicide prevention, and grief support? How will these stories shape the future direction for first responder? I'm going to say suicide prevention, mental health promotion, resilience, kind of the whole spectrum of upstream, midstream, and downstream. And we want to make sure that we leave enough time for some discussion. All right, so with that, I'm going to invite Chris to come up and just give us a little bit more data to set the context of why this is important.
I'll make shadow animals as I go. All right, so this is a little bit of data. I'm not going to inundate you with it, that kind of stuff, but it's important to me. One thing I didn't say in our introduction is my wife died of suicide in 2003. My brother, who was a law enforcement officer, he was a law enforcement officer in training in 2008, and 10 of my colleagues in EMS and fire, and that's why this is super important to me. So that's that other piece of my story. So what I did is I took the death records for my state. The state of Minnesota from 2001 to 16, I have all manners, natural accident, suicide, homicide, and indeterminate in those records. They consist of lots of data, including social security numbers, which are not private when you die. I teamed up with our Peace Officer Standards Training Board, or Minnesota Fire Certification Board, or Emergency Medical Services Regulatory Board, gave them every name, hundreds of thousands of names, which they cross-match with their records, and they told me which ones matched. So I have a very real understanding of what our responders are dying of that I don't believe has been done on that level before, because so many of us have different jobs. So my primary job is an educator, and if I were to die, the fact that I'm a paramedic would be lost because the death record only shows one vocation. So it's super important. So anyway, some results of my data looking at crude mortality rates. So you can see the general public, 13.48. This excludes prisoners, inmates. This excludes anybody under the age of 18, which only eliminated 2 emergency medical responders, EMRs, so statistically insignificant. And this excluded people who were unemployed, because those are high-risk no-gos. It does include retirees. I believe firmly that once you're an emergency responder, you're always an emergency responder. You don't drop it at the door when you walk away. So I think that's critical. And I think any program has to reach out to retirees or prepare people for that transition. It's critical. So firefighter crude mortality rates are unacceptably high. Obviously, responders overall are 22 per 100,000. Firefighters were in the 21 per 100,000. Police approaching 23 per 100,000, which is statistically significant data. This is blown up a little bigger than I wanted, but I ran several hypotheses. I'll spare you all the details of that because your eyes will gloss over and you'll probably fall asleep. And if you want to know, see me afterwards and I'll help you. But it's propensity score matching is a big part of it, which mimics a randomized control study. And I did match responders that died of suicide with responders who died of natural causes, and responders who died of suicide to the general population who's died of suicide. I think it's important to compare within and without, if that makes sense. So what I found is, this has an educational spin on it. I wanted to also know the education levels because we think those are protective in the population. Responders who are dying of suicide have overall higher levels of education than responders who do not. So that's a concerning thing. It tells me we might not be doing our job in the education. That's a shot at my own discipline in the education piece and preparing people appropriately. And our rates of suicide are higher. Notice I didn't put the crude mortality rates of EMS people, because in my state, I have to have, the denominator has to be the number of people working in the field, which is easy to get for police and fire because I went to the retirement systems and they got the numbers. EMS in my state, we track how many people are certified, not how many people are actually doing the job. So a big hole in our own data. So when you look at everything else, and when you control for dual roles, so police who respond to medicals, fire who respond to medicals, and EMS only or single role EMS, being a firefighter or being a police officer also is statistically insignificant. What it's about is going to the calls where there's death, disability, and that part of the job more so than the other parts of the job. So that's what it's about. And it makes me really worried about EMS because that's our whole job, is concentrating on that piece. And we don't, and I just say it's gotta be high, but I don't know how high. This is the propensity score matching in the education levels. The red lines are for what the average, now this is based on white males. So for every year of a white male of education, a white male has suicide rates decreased by 2% up to bachelor's level, at which time they climb again. For a black male, it actually increases 8% for every year. So I just need to preface it with that. But if we look at what the white male rates are in women, I'm sorry, there's some research, so somebody do some, please. So my findings were completely opposite. So the higher the education level, the more suicide in a responder. So not what I expected, the bell curve's off. So that's my quick, in a nutshell thing. There's my contact information if you want the other sorted details.
Great, I'm gonna call up Carla now to show us what it looks like to implement a lived experience story into a national program.
I just want to echo Sally's earlier comments about the importance of lived experience stories. So we certainly recognize that as well, that first responders like to hear stories from other first responders. And so we embarked on a video project where we interviewed 11 first responders from a variety of different disciplines so that we could showcase their stories and different educational programs, training programs that we deliver. So I'm going to share just one of those with you today.
I've been working in the fire department for 14 years now. I grew up for a lot of years. I suffered from severe depression and anxiety, and to mask those feelings, the first thing that was available to me was alcohol. I felt like I didn't have to worry about, what was going on at home, what was going on at school. That was my outlet, and it just progressed and progressed. And the more I drank, the bigger my anxiety ended up being at the end of that spree. So I just had to drink and use more and more and more. So it was a vicious cycle. When I started to work, I was quite a bit different, I felt, than my coworkers, and I felt like I was living two separate lives: my work persona and then my outside persona. It was a lot of substance abuse, a lot of lying, a lot of people pleasing, fear-based decisions that were not good for me or anyone around me. I was so desperate, I was so depressed, and the grief and the absolute feelings of worthlessness and all that stuff that comes along with those days and what I was doing to cope. And it became so bad that a couple of times I had attempted suicide. It was they were very desperate. Looking back at it today, I'd say they were, cries for attention. I wanted somebody to say, how can I help? Like, what's going on? What's so bad? What can I do for you? I kind of felt I was at a crossroads where it was either I can, choose to live or continue doing what I'm doing and die an alcoholic death, and I felt that was coming very soon for me. So I chose to live. As far as mental health goes, there wasn't much discussion about it. All my instructors and trainers were full-time firefighters, and most of them had come from a military background. And these men don't share their feelings with each other. It's bottled up, and suck it up and take it. You're meant to be a man's man. In that world, it's tough. It's still very old school and still very primitive that way, where you're indestructible, and you're not affected by emotions or by feelings, and certainly not the case.
Good. Elbows.
It's very difficult to be dealing with your mental health issue, as well as possibly an addiction, and to know people are talking about it.
Step back, cross.
It doesn't make anything easier at all. It's a scary place to be in. You're digging deeper and deeper. It's a bigger hole you have to crawl out of, and you're just looking for one hand.
Good. Relax. Breathe.
I didn't know that I was dealing with depression and anxiety. I didn't know that's why I was drinking. I wasn't educated enough about the subject to know that was my medication for my mental health issues.
Remember, love it here, accept it here, apply it here.
I've overcome my substance abuse and my alcohol consumption. I've been 6 years sober now, and I had to learn a lot about myself and who I was pretending to be.
All right, round of applause. That's great work. Okay, now I want to just shift a little bit more to a discussion amongst our panelists, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So, why, in your experiences, why do you think these lived experience stories have such a powerful impact on changing culture, or do they, in what you've seen so far?
I think it's mandatory. I think because first responders are afraid to get help, and they think that they're the only one out there that needs help, and they're ashamed and they're afraid of repercussions from the job, how people are going to think about them. So when you hear these stories that's out and about amongst themselves, then I think that's going to make the difference in them leading them to get help, if there's the proper help to go to, because a lot of times in first responders, they don't know where to go to and who they can trust. Trust is a huge thing with first responders. So if we give them an outlet and where they can trust, then they can reach out. But this is the first step, hopefully.
Thanks. Other thoughts?
I agree with you, so we're good. We got that going for us. As a former firefighter, one of the things, the analogies that I'll use is that when we're in a house fire and we're pulling down the ceiling with what's called a pipe pole, you're in a self-contained breathing apparatus, mask, you can't see the other person's face, and you push yourself and you keep pulling down that ceiling even though you're exhausted. And why do you do it? Because you can't see everybody else's face, and you're like, they must not be in the same shape I'm in. And I think psychological trauma is like that. I think we just don't give each other permission to say those things, and so we can't see that other people are in distress, and we do think we're the only ones, and your story has power over you, and the more you say your story, the better it is, the less grip that story has on you. So I think it's really powerful when responders came out and say, it happened to me too. That's a similar experience, and I think it's really powerful stuff when somebody does share their story. But hard to get them do share. We're suspicious by nature.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I made sure that we talked about with the Denver Fire Department is that it wasn't just Juan who shared his story. The captains and assistant chiefs, and even the chief, I said, you're not getting off the hook, dude. You're going to tell your story too. And so Chief Tate said, and this is the narrative that he felt comfortable with, right? Everybody's got control over what story they can tell. And he said, of course, who hasn't been brought to their knees by an overwhelming life circumstance. I certainly have. And when I needed to, I reached out to gain perspective. And that's made all the difference. And so if you're struggling, I want you to come to me because I get it and I've got your back. And that message from the leadership, yeah, I've been there too. I get it. It's hard, but here's what you do. You do this because it helps. Just kind of opened up permission in a way that hadn't been there before. Other perspectives on lived experience stories and why they can help shift culture or help with the overall efforts of resilience and mental health promotion and suicide prevention.
I was going to say, I think there are a couple of layers here. One of them is personal responsibility for anyone. But, you know, I thought about it after, many years after all of the things I experienced, and no one ever reached out to me because we're really good about putting on a face and always having that happy face. And so that's not their fault, that's my fault. And there is a stigma about mental health in this country, I suspect in many countries, but we have to overcome that. You know, if we have professional athletes that are completely doted over by psychologists and trainers and masseuses and physicians, why don't we take care of our first responders, our emergency responders in the same way? Why don't we let them know they've got to take responsibility to get, help early? Number two, though, as was just said, we need to have the systems in place to do it. And I think many organizations, no matter what your profession is, don't have the systems in place. So it's pretty hard to ask for help if there isn't really any help to be had there. And then I think the issue is, I think we're all here because it's a cultural issue. We're afraid to admit weakness, and we're afraid that, it's contagious. And, we have to overcome so many things as a collective, as a society. So I'm a big believer in grassroots, and you can use social media, you can use blogging, you can use webcasts. There are so many ways to tell stories in this world, and we all need to be doing it because it is the stories that convince people, okay, I guess I'm just like you, I can share my story too.
Aren't doing anything.
I don't, because these guys all speak, so.
Come on.
Yeah, it starts with a couple stories at the table, and then before you know it, you have 7 or 8 individuals that are sharing something with you, so.
Yeah. So, the unchecked despair can be contagious, but the hope and the courage and the, being the first ones out there, and then you're like, well, they did it, and they're still respected and trusted and elevated. I can tell you of all the storytellers from that video, 3/4 of you got a promotion within 18 months. I mean, the trustworthiness was high. Let me switch to the next one. What do you think is the future around this, about shifting culture, using stories to shift culture? Do you see a vision for where we might be headed?
We've been working, my organization's been working with the largest ambulance service in our state to kind of shift that, and Dr. Brendan Miskowicz here with me. She's one of our board members, and she's been working on it a lot with Assist for a peer support team, a optional Safe Talk course for those who want to, but they'll be paid to attend it, and some of the stories there that have come out of that, and I don't know, she tells the story better than I do, but I don't know if she can yell louder than I can.
You want to try?
Mike,
Sure.
One really cool result, I think.
Yeah, so I may be living in Minnesota, but I'm from Louisiana, so I know how to be loud. I think everyone can hear me. But basically what we've done is we've rolled out this program where we're training the higher levels of leadership and some key leaders from the front line in Assist, and then all of the EMTs and medics on the streets and dispatch will have the opportunity to go through Safe Talk. We've done only 2 Assist class and 1 Safe Talk so far, and I've already had at least 5 people tell me they've done interventions. More than that, tell me that they've at least asked about suicide. But the most awesome story is that the day after I taught Safe Talk, the first one, I had 2 medics in the ambulance at work, just sitting there getting ready for their shift. And one of them says to the other, yeah, I went to that Safe Talk class yesterday. Your wife taught it because it just happened to be my husband who was the other paramedic. She's pretty cool. But then went on to say, yeah, I mean, it made me realize how real this stuff is. And I guess I didn't realize I could talk about it. And I gave examples in the class, and I don't know if anybody knew, but all of the examples were about me. And so then the other paramedic said, well, look, I've told you that I went through the assist class, and you're telling me that these are real life examples, and I can see that you're choking up as you're talking to me right now. So I'm going to ask you, are you thinking about suicide? And before he even finished the word suicide, the other medic broke down in tears and said, yes, I am. And I mean, the way the story was told, I mean, you could just tell he went to work that day just waiting. He so badly wanted someone to ask him that question. And those doors were open so quickly. And so, they called dispatch. They went out of service, which came up as a huge concern for people going through the trainings initially, because as soon as you go out of service, then people think, well, what's wrong? Why are they out of service? What's going on with them? And they were able to go out of service, and they worked through the whole PAL model through assist and kept the person safe. It all just worked out so beautifully. And I mean, that was within 24 hours of a Safe Talk training. And we've only done 3 so far. So I can only imagine the impact that'll happen with this 700 person wide EMS organization. So
and the stories that are told in the assist training really set the tone. Everybody shares, and they share very openly. It's,
one of the other things I heard from that example was that the people delivering the training embedded their own stories into the delivery of it. So then the trainers make it feel like it's by, about, and for this community,
yes,
not just some random training made in Canada. I love Canada, but that's not been plopped in our hands and we got to do the thing. No, it felt, this is us.
Yeah, that cultural competency piece, understanding the culture of EMS was imperative. Yeah.
Okay. Other ideas about the vision for the future? Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
I'll just share one. So one of the things that we've really been focused on is trying to move towards more comprehensive systems level change, so that different departments or agencies aren't doing sort of piecemeal things like a little bit of training here and there. So we developed a national standard for paramedic organizations, was our starting point in terms of the first responder discipline, so that they'd actually have embedded in what some aspirational standards would be for them to achieve around the psychological health and well-being of their employees. So that for us is a really important, I think, direction in terms of expanding that across some of the other first responder disciplines as well.
Thank you. Any other visions for the future?
Yeah, actually, I believe that we need to still talk about suicide prevention, and starting from the start of their careers, not during the middle or be reactionary. It has to be from the start of their careers. It has to also encompass, trainings across the lifespan of their careers. And you have to have the pieces in place, like I said earlier, for people to go to. There's a recent study, it's called the Ruderman study for law enforcement. And in that, they said out of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, only 3 to 5% have any suicide prevention programs embedded in their agency. And until we change that, we are still going to have this problem. So, but again, we have to have the program in place for people to trust and to go to when they need help. So the future is putting all those pieces together where people have someone to turn to, and obviously sharing stories.
Can I speak to the clinicians in the room, because that issue of cultural competence is so important. We're a tough bunch. I don't think it really matters which of the disciplines you're talking about. We're hard to crack to get us to open up. It's all about trust. And so if we're going to talk about stories, you have to have a story too about why you care. Why do you want to help us? And you need to know a little bit about us. So go on a ride along, go to a professional development course that focuses on first responders, do something to enhance that credibility, but there's got to be a story behind it. And I found that. If somebody has a relative or this or that, there are ways to use your story to open us up. I would also speak to the leaders in the room. There is an initiative in Illinois called Chiefs Lead the Way, which says, if we're going to make it safe to ask for help, then we want to have regular mental health checkups, then the chiefs ought to do it first. And I think that's a great initiative. And then we have one here in Colorado called Make It Safe, where we just have to change the culture to tell us that we have to trust and we have to open up. So it's kind of a symbiotic relationship.
Cool. Thank you all. I just want to acknowledge one more person in the audience over here, Lieutenant John Coppage, who just reminds me that, you know, one of the things that's so effective in catching this early and kind of bringing down the intensity is peer support. And peer support is all about shared experience and knowing how to tell your story kind of at the right level to get that compassion, but then not make it all about you. I mean, it's really an important skill to have, and really grateful that you're here today, Lieutenant, and that you are doing this work both in Colorado and nationally. And if subtle plug, please come to our session tomorrow, all about peer support and in the first responder tomorrow afternoon, 2:15. All right, let's open it up. What kind of questions do we have? Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
So my question is, I'm in Los Angeles County, and I've had, especially since we moved into our new facility, I've had captains and chiefs of the LAPD and the peer support, LA Fire Department and peer supports come into our office looking for ways to intervene earlier with these guys who might be out on medical leave because of an injury or mental health leave, and they want to know what they can do to help their peers get through this difficult time before it leads to a suicide attempt. So how do we find someone who could be this role model, who could tell their story when this is such a kind of closed and quiet, silent group?
I don't know if you remember, but I kind of gave them an ultimatum.
Oh.
I did. I said, you know this stuff. You know it. The thing that's going to shift culture is when people see it's you. And I know it's you because you told me on this survey, over a quarter of you have been to mental health services in the last 12 months or something like that. But then it took, 18 months of what does it look like? Because it was kind of unprecedented. So I would show them the examples. I would show them this video from Canada. The ones that you'll find from the Denver Fire Department are Total Wellness, Denver Fire Department Total Wellness. It's one of the best things I've gotten to be a part of in my entire career. And then the one from the Denver Police Department, which we had other collaborators on, so the International Association of Chiefs of Police. That video is called Breaking the Silence, Suicide Prevention in Law Enforcement. Both excellent examples of the power of story. Yes, in the back.
First, I just want to say thank you for your courage. I come from a family, of cops, mom, dad, brother, former EMT myself, and I work full-time in suicide prevention. But in all the reports and in hearing you talk today, that fear of punishment, that fear of professional jeopardy, how do we, knowing that as first responders, it would be irrational for us to assume that people aren't going to have mental health issues with that kind of trauma exposure. How do we really, even through the leadership, how do we still remove that component? Because that's the one thing I haven't quite wrapped my head around is how do we get leadership and others to understand that people, when they're in mental health support, they're actually better at their jobs, they're safer at their jobs. How do we, I almost compare, like we talk about celebrity suicides all the time. These are people at the top of their game, and no one really questioned about their professional ability. So how do we, is there something there that we can leverage to show that no, the people that are getting the help are actually better at their jobs?
I think the one thing that we need to guarantee the person that's coming to us for help is confidentiality. And because if you don't have confidentiality, then it's a moot point. So, but that's also dealing with administration, knowing what, in the peer support field on what we're not going to tell them and how we're going to get them help. So we'll explain the structure to them and what works best. And if you get administration on board, it's so key, because one of the key things we did before I retired is we made a video, and we had the commissioner of the state police actually talk about, hey, we believe in this program. We actually sent paperwork home to all the families. We believe in this program. We believe in the trust in the program. So if we work well with administration, and we'll fight back against, because people will still say, I want to know where this person is, on sick leave, and we're not going to tell them. So, but we're going to work together with administration to help get people to move forward in their mental health, and not necessarily tell them the certain details on if they on sick leave for 30 days. So I think that's the best piece, but you have to guarantee that confidentiality.
And the administration
no
on board piece.
Yeah.
So when I saw how the Denver Fire Department was Chief Tate getting up and saying, if you are struggling, you need to come to me, and I've got your back. And we will persist. We do whatever it takes to get you back on your feet again. If you don't, however, you know what, the chances are really good. We're gonna have some kind of performance issue, and then we gotta deal with that. So let's not even go down there. You just come to me. I got you. And that, from the top, set the culture.
Can I add to that real quick?
Yeah.
I've had some success starting with people who are bereaved by suicide, having a panel from police, fire, EMS, and then starting to do that at agencies and saying, hey, we're you and this happened to us. And then we tell our stories. And then usually what happens is people in leadership and other people come and self-identify afterwards. And then I ally with those chiefs and those directors who are loss survivors, because there, to me, is nobody more powerful than a loss survivor to carry the banner. And then you reach out from there.
Okay, we got a few more questions. Let's see if we can hit Joe.
This is for Chris. Statistically speaking, lower socioeconomic wage earners are more at risk for suicide. You said the higher the degree, the more the statistics show a higher level of suicide. Did you do any follow up onto that and to see why that is?
No, well, right now that's the quantitative. That's the what is the problem. Now comes the why. We're working on on that in several ways. One is interviewing. First, we're going to do paramedics, and then we'll interview EMTs, and we'll interview firefighters, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, if you're really interested, we just got accepted today for the IASP conference in Derry, London, that area, to present some of that. Brittany and I and her husband. But we're asking people to, like, what are their stressors? What are their stories? Things like that. And we're going to try to unwind that. We also want to do, Brittany and I are both psychological autopsy investigators. We want to do a series of psychological autopsies now and see what that aggregate data is and what are those commonalities that those people experience. So the living and the not living, and hit it from both those angles, if that answers your question. But I'm not there yet. Haven't gotten that far.
Okay, we're going to take one more brief question, and then I'm going to come back for a very brief final thought from each of you. So think about that. One brief question. Yeah, right.
So I'm a psychiatrist in Ottawa, in Canada. I'm one of the first responders clinic. I'm part of the first responders mental health network.
Just a little louder, sorry.
And I'm part of the first responders mental health network. But one of the stories that people always tell me by the time they get to see me is like how they feel betrayed by the organisation, or how they feel humiliated. And that often, I don't hear that in these stories very often. And you don't see it written up very much, but it seems to be clinically quite an important problem. I just wanted to comment on that.
That's a good question.
Well, I go ahead. I wrote an article when I started blogging about this issue years ago. I just used the term throwaway cops. And that article has gotten more hits than anything I've written in 12 years. And that is the sentiment. They feel betrayed, they don't feel betrayed, and for good reason. And I think that's what we have to change. And I think we change it by looking at a sports model or a medical model and changing this issue about we only go to mental health when we're broken. We've got to start looking at it as a maintenance issue, not a repair issue.
So something that's on the horizon that a number of these folks have been a part of is probably by World Suicide Prevention Day, September 10th. We'll be launching this nation's first set of workplace suicide prevention guidelines, which is not all about get your troubled workers to the counselors. It's also you need to clean up your shop. You need to do a better job of creating a less toxic environment, less humiliating and bullying, and not letting your people sleep, and kind of all the things that we know contribute to despair. So then you'll have something official to hang your hat on to leverage change. So I'm going to summarize, and then we're going to go down the line. Okay, so often telling stories can be helpful for the storyteller. It puts a structure of a narrative on what often feels chaotic and overwhelming, and it also creates community. When one person tells a story, then another person says, me too, and now people aren't alone in their despair, and you can start to build solidarity. It also helps the listener create empathy and compassion when understanding another's trouble through the lens of their own story. They see the humanity. And once we've got a number of listeners, that's when we start changing culture, because we have a more powerful tale to tell. So let's start with you, Chris. What are some of your final takeaway?
There's that stories matter, and persistence matters. Having lost my wife, my brother, 10 colleagues, I need to convert that into, their lives need to have meant something. They're not going to have died in vain. I'm not going to let them. no way. They're not forgotten. And we need to save lives going forward, and maybe through them we can save other people. I guess is my overwhelming thought.
Yeah, I would just add that I think the stories are so important in terms of opening people's ears and making them feel passionate about making a difference and getting involved. But I do think it's very important for us to have some of those structural pieces in place, whether it's guidelines or strategies or standards that people can turn to when they ask the next question, which is what can we do about it? We need to be there to offer them our best advice on how to move forward in a comprehensive way.
And we'll just mention again that Canada's had a standard for psychological safety in the workforce for, I don't know, a decade? Yeah. Final thoughts?
Yeah, I hoping to get to a point where we make this as easy as getting a cup of coffee in the morning and talking about it at the table.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just actually is to have not just the peer support in name only, to have a viable and a thriving peer support, so that people can have an outlet to go to it and to share the stories, because that's where peer support is so important. To go to one of our own and say, hey, I feel comfortable talking to you, and that it's okay to feel, that you want to take your life, but I'm going to help you get through this and get you the right resources.
Thanks, John.
If you heard anything today that motivated you, be the seed. Take that out of here. Don't go to the next session and forget about it. Write yourself a note now. Go out and make the difference, because we are the ones that are going to make the difference.
Round of applause for these awesome. I'm going to ask our panelists, who are the storytellers, to share a brief version of their story. One of the things that's really important if you're trying to encourage people to tell stories is, number one, that they feel ready and prepared, and they understand what's kind of at stake when they go into it, and that they also are positioned to tell their story in a way that's going to move them towards the goal that they're hopeful for. And so a lot of times when I'm coaching people to tell their story, there's a discernment process. Why do you want to do this? What are the potential pros and cons? And then also really framing much of the storytelling narrative construction around what we call a hero's journey framework. So this whole idea of, going into the dark forest and kind of understanding what happened during that really difficult time, noticing what the turning points were in that narrative, and then who were the guides who came alongside, because rarely do we get through these things alone. Where's the magic and the elixirs and the trials and the tribulations, because a pathway into healing is never a straight line. And then finally, kind of we call it the great reward in the hero's journey framework. What is the thing that you now walk away with that you didn't have before you went into the dark forest? And so some of the folks in here are also part of the Gut, Grit, and Grind anthology project that I mentioned at the beginning, which is a men's anthology project. And so over the past 3 years, we've been coming together to help build those narratives and so forth. So I asked our storytellers to kind of pull a piece of that together to share with you. And if you don't mind, Vaughn, I'd like to start with you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So Sally seems to make this difficult for me.
He loves me, he really does.
Yeah, I'd rather run into a burning building or climb a 100-foot area. The hardest thing, I think, was to come forward and do the video for me. And as Sally probably recalls, I sent about 100 text messages, I can't do this. And eventually I did, and I was thoroughly afraid that it was going to affect my promotions, how people looked at me, and it was tough, as is today. But I got through it, and I think for the betterment of the job, but not always for me. It's still hard sometimes.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for being here. And when we did our 6-month follow-up after Juan's video was in the training, and we asked the firefighters, what did you remember of this 3-hour training? And they said, Juan. And he was worried about promotion, but you got promoted.
Yeah.
And then about 6 months after that, 9 News came forward and said, does anybody want to talk on statewide television? Juan said yes. And then he texted me that night and he said, thanks for nudging. This is some of the most important work I get to do. So I'm really grateful you're here, Juan, and your story makes a huge difference. Go Van.
What I didn't say in my introduction is I'm also a survivor of my brother's suicide, as well as some friends' suicides that affected me over the lifetime. So when I became in charge of our peer support program, obviously suicide was a major issue in the state police. We lost several people to suicide. So it all started with sharing my story, not just to our peer support team, but to others who, you know, in any realm of police work that would be willing to listen. So it just opened up, and actually one of the hardest parts actually that I had when writing my story for the Guts, Grits, and Grind was reliving that, my story of, now it's 39 years ago, but boy did it hit me when I started writing my story, and I found myself sobbing at the computer while I was writing it, and yeah, I could probably break down right now because that never goes away. But the best part about it is that I know that when I share my story and other people's stories of survival, that makes people hopefully get the help they need and thrive, because it is an amazing gift. And one quick story I'll give you is that somebody, I had to threaten involuntary treatment for a police officer. And that person went in very reluctantly and said, "I hate you." And I said, "That's okay, but you're alive." Later on, I saw her, I was at a funeral home for something unrelated to suicide, and so I'm walking by this closet, and this person grabs me in a dark closet in a funeral home, not good. So this person said, "Thank you so much, you saved my life." And that's why I think all of us are up here today. We do the things that we do.
Thank you. John?
So I told you that I worked as a law enforcement officer for 23 years. I worked as a patrol officer, I worked as a detective, I was our community policing coordinator, and I was a hostage negotiator on the SWAT team for 19 years. And if you're a first responder, you know, over 10, 15, 20 years, it can happen in the first year. You see so much tragedy, you see so much trauma. For me, I took a PTSD evaluation after I retired and flagged really high on dead children because I had been labeled the king of SIDS when I was in patrol, and then as a detective and public information officer, I probably went to every homicide, train wreck, airplane crash, every bad thing that happened in our city the entire time I worked there, and you carry that around like baggage. What I didn't tell you at the beginning is there were two times in my career when I contemplated suicide, once sitting there holding a gun, and the other time contemplating a whole plan about how I was going to do this without traumatizing anybody else. But that story is a very long story. The recovery from that is a very long story. It didn't just involve me. I had help, I had mentors, I had guides, I had my upbringing, my parents, you know, their voices rang out in my head. And honestly, as a hostage negotiator, my own words went through my ears when I was contemplating my own death. I've talked countless people out of committing suicide, and I heard my own words, and they were powerful. But what happened most was I kept all that inside, because despite all the therapy, I never told anybody that I'd contemplated suicide, because we're all afraid of losing our career. And that haunts you. You're afraid. So I didn't do anything until after I retired and my friend took his life. And I started talking about suicide and realized 2 of the neighboring agencies that were next to us had suicides while I was working. We never heard about them. And I started realizing that what I was suffering, I was not suffering alone. And I want you to hear that. Emotional injuries are like so many other, we just don't equate them with physical injuries, but the earlier you ask for help, the more likely you are to resolve the issue than if you let it fester on and on. And I know that many of you here are champions of this cause and many others. And I want you to hear also that, I founded the Law Enforcement Survival Institute. It sounds like a very lofty institute of higher education, but sort of like the large organizations of Microsoft and Apple, it was founded in my basement. And all I could do as an old cop who suffered was to assemble a team of experts to help me learn about what I needed to know. And now I travel around the country and around the world teaching other first responders how to build resilience Because if we're talking, I'm sorry, some of you, I may offend you, but if we're talking about suicide, it's too late. Let's get to people earlier and help them build resilience, help them get help them find the pathways they need. Those are the stories that have to motivate. And so I bet everybody in the room has a story about how you have helped someone else. Those are the powerful stories. So I encourage you to be a storyteller as well.